The Lord before whom I have walked faithfully will send his angel with you and make your journey a success so that you can get a wife for my son from my own clan and from my father's family. But you will be released from my oath if when you go to my clan and they refuse to give her to you. So Abraham told him God is going to send an angel before him. God sent the angel, and Rebekah came out to the well right at the perfect time, and she did exactly what the man prayed so he could know that this was the very one that God picked and chose himself for Isaac to marry. But the main point I want you all to see is that even after all of this, all of these divine things, the man praying to God, Rebekah coming out immediately afterwards and answering this man's prayers, the angel that Abraham said would guide the man to the right place to find the wife God wanted for Isaac. And even after her own family agreed and said that this thing is from God and we can say nothing about it, even with all of that, Rebekah still had to be willing. Did y'all hear me? Rebekah had to be willing. Even after being the one that God chose to marry Isaac, even after all these signs, even after an angel made their paths merge together at the perfect time, she still had to give God a yes to her marital destiny. Verse 57, let's read it again. Then they said, let's call the young woman in and ask her about it. So they called Rebekah and asked her, will you go with this man? And she said, I will go. Will is the beginning of the word willingly. I will go. And that was the moment that changed her life forever. She was willing to submit to the will of God. So when you're with someone or even observing someone to see if they are of God or from God, make sure that when you're praying, and this is a point I'm going to be praying from now on for whoever I'm going to marry, I'm going to pray for God to send me a man who is eager for me to join him on this journey of life, and a person who is willing. Because you can have all of heaven and even God himself trying to fight for your marriage and fight for your marital destiny and make sure that the two of you end up together, because he knows what he wants to do in that marriage. But if a person is not willing, if they are not ready to leave their past life behind, if they are not willing to give up the way they were before and see what's on the other side of giving God a real yes, then God will release you from it. Just like Abraham said to his servant, if the woman is not willing to come back with you, you are released from this oath. And people say, oh, if it was God, it would have happened. Yeah, they worked good together. It really seemed like that was the one God had for them. It really seemed like that man made her better. But for some reason, it doesn't work out. But if it was God, it would have worked out. Now, I'm not talking about God tearing up a relationship because he know good and well that's not for you. But I'm talking about God actually being in something and people still saying, oh, well, if it was God, it would have happened. That is not all the way true, because we ourselves have a part to play in our destinies and in our marital destinies that God has for many of us. If he has called you to marriage, he has a specific person in mind. He has never stopped ordaining marriages. I don't know what makes people think that he stopped. He never stopped. All you have to do is ask. But what happened is people stopped waiting on him. People got impatient. People got tied to the world and the things of the world more than the things of God. So when God was trying to do something, they missed it or they forfeited it because they wanted a bowl of soup or a piece of cake over their birthright that God ordained for them to have even before they hit this earth in their mother's womb. Because the Bible says, I know your ending from your beginning. He doesn't work like that. We can't do whatever we want to do and then try try to sprinkle God on it. I'm sorry. God is not obligated to bless anything that he did not ordain or put together. And that's why the Bible says, what God has put together, let no man put asunder. There's a lot of things that God is not putting together, and it don't matter if you cry and fast for 1,000 days, he'll never bless it, because he know that there was a witch sent to destroy your destiny, and he know that there was an abusive man who finna beat you for breakfast, lunch, and dinner after you get married and say, I do. And it don't matter what you do about it, I'm not blessing it. God won't even look at it. And it's a passage in the Bible, I believe Ezekiel 10, but don't let me lie to you, that talks about God not blessing the marriages of these Israelites when they went to marry these strange women. And there's the side of God that false gospel and false doctrine just don't teach about. They lie to people and they tell you grace, 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 and you can do whatever you want, until you look up in this false doctrine of grace, which was really a message of flesh in disguise, has destroyed your entire life and destiny. And it's not until then, people 50, 60, 70 years old crying out to God saying what happened, and now they've realized they've went too far. Y'all, I'm telling y'all, you want what God has for you, and you want the person who God has for you, because God knows best. But nevertheless, you have to make sure that the person you are courting is willing, because if they're not, and if they're still tied to the things of this world and to their own will and their own way, it doesn't matter if 100 angels come from heaven or how many confirmations they get that you're the one. It will mean nothing, because they are not willing. And really quickly, I want to finish the point I was trying to make earlier. Just because something does not work out or something does not happen does not mean it wasn't the will of God. Because just like we saw, Rebecca had to say yes even after all the signs, and then she had to get up and go in order to marry Isaac. And even when you look at the children of Israel who came out of slavery, God himself came and delivered the children of Israel out of Egypt and tried to bring them into the promised land. But they fought him every step of the way. They complained every moment. They even reminisced and waxed nostalgia about Egypt, and Satan made them forget that they were actually slaves and in bondage in Egypt. And they were so afraid when it was time to go in that 10 of them brought back a foolish report to Moses. And when God heard it, he said, enough is enough. This will go to the next generation. This promised land is no longer for you. And only Caleb and Joshua were allowed to go in it, and the other millions of people who had come from Egypt, who God had promised would enter into this promised land, were not able to enter it, and they died off and their eyes never saw it. Now, was that the will of God for that to happen to them? No. Was that the will of God for God to do all of these miraculous signs just for them to get to the wilderness and he say, you stopping right here, you ain't going in? No. But they kept speaking against the promise. They kept profaning it. They kept looking at it like it was nothing, like I talked about in the Let Them Eat Cake episode. And they kept saying Egypt was what they wanted over their promise. And when it was time to move, they even allowed Satan to fill their hearts with fear and talk about the giants in the land instead of how big and giant their God was. And God had enough. And even with love and God-ordained relationships and marriages, that still happens today, and it's very sad. But God is not going to continue letting us do his sons like that, ladies, and he's not going to let the men do his daughters like that. I'm sorry, he's just not. And sometimes, unfortunately, the lesson is not learned until it's too late. And now the woman is crying out to God, trying to get back in this man's life. He was a good man. I knew he was for me, God. I messed it up. I cursed him out. I talked bad to him, and he only loved me. Now she crying out to God. And now this man is saying, dang, I knew she was the one. He's crying out to God. And now God can either have mercy or he can say, nah, and do people just like the Israelites. No, I've seen enough. I heard enough. I saw how you thought about this, saw how you treated this, saw how you profaned this, saw how you delayed this because you didn't really want it. So nah, I'm going to give it to somebody else. And that is what has happened to many God-ordained relationships, because people allow the enemy to influence their decisions and get into their heart and make them fear the very thing that God had promised them. Godly Chicks new podcast episode, Love Me Right, available now on Apple Podcast and Spotify.